was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight. But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started. And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
Caroline Levitt talking about these new tariffs and how Trump likes to punch back hard and how he's looking to make a deal with China to try to figure out a lot of what's going on, because this is really stuff that's breaking even as we're getting ready for the show today. Probably as we're on the air here, more things will be coming out. But the first person I thought of when we want to look at what's going on globally was international relations theorist and professor of political science at the University of Chicago, Professor John Mearsheimer. Professor, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here as always, Danny.
Well, look, this is a little different. We've been often talking about the tactical and strategic situation in the Russia-Ukraine war and stuff in the Middle East, but this is a new arena that's been thrust onto the stage here that I think we need to discuss, and I'm interested in seeing what you have to say about some of this stuff. But I want to start off just on the topic that she was referring to there, that Trump is hitting back at China, because obviously there was 185 different countries that were slapped with tariffs of one sort or another. But one of the biggest one is, of course, the number one or number two ranked economy in the world on China, which has the biggest potential implications. And, in her comment there that they're trying to make a deal, the U.S. and China, trying to figure that out. But if China comes back with is gracious enough to want to talk, Trump will be there, but that he's ready to hit back hard. Now, as I say that, she said that last night. Since that time, China has hit back with something even worse. With now just an hour or two ago, I think it was, or maybe a few hours ago, they're saying, no, not only are we not going to back down, we're coming now with 84% tariffs. How do you see this dynamic, but first of all, just between the U.S. and China playing out over this trade war?
Well, I think the Chinese, much like President Trump, are in this game to play hardball. They're not going to let the United States push them around. It's exactly what you would expect. Countries like Russia, countries like Iran, North Korea, and China all understand that when you're dealing with the United States, and especially when you're dealing with President Trump, that he only respects one thing, and that's when you're tough. If you show any weakness with President Trump, he'll romp all over you. He just acts like a classic bully. When he senses weakness, he brings out the steamroller and rolls over you. The Chinese understand this. Putin understands this. The Iranians understand this, and the North Koreans understand this. So it's hardly surprising that the Chinese are pushing back.
The question then is going to be, where is this going to go? Because if Trump is looking for compliance and to try and renegotiate deals, which apparently some are saying that they are, and if China is looking to play hardball, where could this go? I want to bring that Truth Social comment from Trump up, because that was just listed out this morning. This is kind of what his intent seems to be for launching all these tariffs. He said, this is a great time to move your company into the United States of America, like Apple and so many others in record numbers are doing. Zero tariffs and most immediately electric energy hookups and approvals. No environmental delays. Don't wait. Do it now. By saying we're going to make it hard for people to manufacture in all these different countries around the world so that they'll come here and make it, or American companies will do it. But as I understand, that kind of thing is like multiple years process to, fund, start building, construction, hire crew, whatever, and have it produced. But these tariffs have an immediate effect. Can we get to the long term that he's talking about here and still be okay economically in between?
Well, I think he admits, President Trump, that we're going to pay a price in the short term for sure, and maybe even in the medium term. His argument is that we're going to win in the long term. The way I think about this, Danny, in terms of the U.S.-China competition, you have to think about it in terms of both absolute gains and relative gains. And absolute gains means what happens to the United States, what happens to China, all by themselves. Don't compare them. Just look at what happens, absolutely. And then you have to talk about what happens in terms of relative gains. And this is the relative balance of power. I think that what President Trump believes is that everybody is going to be hurt in the short and medium term with regard to the state of their own economy, right? It's just, we're going to pay a price. The Chinese are going to pay a price. But his belief is that in the end, the American economy will improve. We will be in much better shape in an absolute sense in the long term, because we will restore the manufacturing base that we once had. This will have all sorts of consequences for the working class and for employment levels and so forth and so on. So that's one set of calculations. The other set of calculations, which I think matters a lot in Trump's mind, is the relative gains argument. And his basic argument is we may be hurt somewhat in the short and medium term, but the Chinese will be hurt even more in the short and medium term, and they will be hurt in the long term as well. So we will gain a power advantage over the Russians from all of this. That's the relative gains argument. And the absolute gains argument is that the American economy all by itself will just be much better off in the long term. And this will be good politically and socially and economically for all Americans.
But while there is certainly a big trade deficit with China, we still do billions of dollars of trade with them. So if I mean, we can have all the manufacturing home we want that you can build, but if your markets overseas are now going to be constrained, it seems like that's going to be causing a problem for sales.
Yeah, you can make that argument for sure. I mean, as you well know, almost every economist across the political spectrum, from left to right, thinks that this is a boneheaded policy. There are hardly any economists who think that this is going to work out. So we can raise all sorts of reasons to have doubts about how this plays out. And as you know, when you talk about economic changes, or economic policies that fundamentally change the way you do business with another country, it is very difficult to predict how it will play itself out. Just think of the case of Russian sanctions. As you well remember, before the Russia-Ukraine war even started in February 2022, Joe Biden was talking about the terribly effective economic sanctions that the West was going to levy on the Russians. And then once the war started, we were highly confident, we in the West were highly confident that those economic sanctions would bring the Russians to their knees. Well, it certainly has not turned out that way. The Russian economy has done quite well in the face of all these sanctions. And if any economies have been hurt by these sanctions, it's the European economies, especially the German economy. So it didn't work out the way we intended. So this may not work out the way President Trump intends. Can he say for sure? The answer is no. Can you or I say for sure? No. Exactly how this plays out is just very hard to say.
It is, but given recent history and the fact that there are, unlike really with the Russia West economic tariffs and sanctions and all that kind of stuff, I mean, you basically had two sides. You had the West writ large, and then Russia on its side here. This one though is like 1/185. I mean, because it's all over the place, and every country has its own source. Now, what Trump also said, this is just last night. He's saying that, look, I'm still willing to negotiate with some of these people and have some of these tariffs reduced, but he put it in a, rather unflattering way.
This is the largest transaction in the history of our country. And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir.
So aside from the maybe less than pleasant way that he put that from the perspective of those, and I heard that there's at least 50 nations that are doing that. Does that kind of thing, putting it like that out in public, does that have any real impact in what these other countries are going to do? Or do they just say, well, this is Trump being Trump?
Well, what it does is it tells you that the United States is not a reliable partner. Uh, this is the message that is being sent loudly and clearly to the rest of the world, including our allies. I mean, you and I were talking about the US China competition and how all of this fits in to that rivalry, but that's just one dimension. What about our allies in East Asia? I mean, what is the message that we're sending to them? Take a country like South Korea that lives near to China and depends heavily on the United States for its security. How does it think about whether or not the United States is a reliable ally? When you listen to Trump talk, you can't help but say to yourself, if you're South Korea or if you're Indonesia or if you're Australia, that I'm not sure the United States is going to be there for us in the crunch. I'm not sure that I want to continue to have close economic relations with the United States like I've had in the past. Maybe I'll think about having closer economic relations with the Chinese because the Chinese at this point in time look more reliable. So the problem with President Trump's approach is that he treats everybody with contempt. And he thinks that he can slap everybody around and that this will have no negative consequences. And indeed, everybody will come begging and he will be free to choose who he wants to cut a deal with and who he doesn't want to cut a deal with. And once he cuts a deal with a country that he likes or he thinks the United States should be allied with, will live happily ever after. This is not my sense of how international politics or interpersonal politics works. And I think there's going to be a significant price to pay down the road beyond the economic consequences of all of this for the United States. I mean, I think that angering virtually every state on the planet and sowing doubts in the minds of every policymaker around the globe about the reliability of the United States is not a smart policy.
And let's take one example of that and see how it could potentially play out in multiple ways in the both the near and the medium term, and that is in Vietnam. There was apparently Vietnam was one of the first ones that publicly basically said, yes, we'll do whatever you say. In fact, they said we're willing to have like a zero tariff, something like that, because as it turns out, Vietnam, 30% of their GDP is based on stuff that are trade with the United States. So it is a huge component there. And they've been slapped with, I think, a 46% tariff. And it's got a lot of panic going on over there. But then there's been resistance, at least what's reported publicly, from the administration to actually be willing to make a deal. Like they want something even, I don't know what's worse than 0% tariffs, but they seem to be not willing. They're very eager to make a deal like that. What is the impact to a country like Vietnam that's basically made itself reliant on trade with the United States if they don't think they can trust us?
Well, the thing is that with regard to Vietnam, there's not just simply an economic dimension like the one that you described. There's a security dimension as well. The Vietnamese are a country, or Vietnam is a country that lives in mortal fear of the Chinese. And for very good reason. They have disputes all around the South China Sea. And furthermore, in 1979, China invaded Vietnam and they actually had a war. So the Chinese and the Vietnamese have a rich history of rivalry. And we have a deep-seated interest, given the US-China competition, to have good relations with Vietnam, and having good economic relations enhances having good military relations or good security relations. So we should be working with the Vietnamese. We should be working with the Indonesians, the Malaysians, the Singaporeans, and so forth and so on, to have good relations. We have a vested interest in having good economic relations with all of Southeast Asia, for security reasons as well as for economic reasons. So you can see what the negative consequences are from a security point of view, not to mention from an economic point of view of what the Trump administration is doing.
And look, I can't even believe I'm about to what I'm about to say here, because I'm going to play a soundbite from John Bolton. But in this rare case, I think he's pretty close to being right.
Is there a long-term cost on this, whatever the short-term impact is?
I think we've incurred a lot of the cost already, not just because of Trump's tariff policy, but what he's done on Ukraine, what he threatens to do to NATO. I can see all over the world, from Europe to the Far East, the decades of effort by many, many Americans in government and out of government to build up relationships of trust, of good faith, of reliance, of dependability, that the United States deserves to be the leader of the world to protect its own interest, not because of economic relations, but because people trust us. They don't trust us anymore, and it's going to be very hard to rebuild. This is the wide open gap that we have left for the Chinese to drive through, and I think they're moving along. Trump simply doesn't grasp any of that. He doesn't understand alliances as long-term propositions. He just sees them as one transaction after the other, and that's not the way they work.
Now, I don't think that this is all just over the last, almost 3 months since Trump was inaugurated. I think that a lot of that loss of trust is really going back even longer, maybe even decades of continual degradation of trust in the U.S. as a partner. But you mentioned this issue of trust already. I mean, is Bolton on it, or is he overstating some things?
Well, he's not overstating the basic problem. I mean, there's no question that trust does matter. And there's no question that having good relations in the economic realm has an impact on relations in the security realm. So he's right in that regard. I would note, picking up on what you said, that John Bolton is responsible for a lot of the distrust that existed before President Trump came back to office on January 20th of this year. You want to remember that Vladimir Putin is very critical of himself. Vladimir Putin is critical of Vladimir Putin for having trusted the United States throughout many of his early years as Russian president. And he makes it clear he's never going to let that happen again. But it was John Bolton and previous Republican presidents like George W. Bush and previous Democratic presidents like Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton who violated the trust that the Russians had in the United States. What Trump is doing here is he's just exacerbating that problem tenfold. He's taking what was a bad situation and he's making it much worse. But we live in a world where hardly anybody trusts the United States. Certainly the Ukrainians don't, certainly the Europeans don't, certainly the Iranians don't, certainly the Chinese don't. We can go down the list, and the situation has gotten critical at this point in time, and there's no evidence that it's going to improve. You want to remember that Trump has just started his presidency. We have a little less than 4 more years of him in the driver's seat. One can only wonder what it's going to look like when he finally leaves office, given how he's performed in these first few months.
Well, and I actually want to ask on that question there, because you've said a couple of times that trust is important. You just reiterated it again here. Can you maybe come up with some kind of physical manifestations of how that could work against us in the international relations? And we'll just project for the next, almost 4 years going forward there. What could that loss of trust look like that can harm us? What does it even look like?
Well, let's take the Russian case, which we've talked about on a number of occasions. We would like to settle this conflict in Ukraine. We'd like to come up with a genuine peace agreement. And as we've talked about many times, that peace agreement involves the whole question of how much territory the Russians take from Ukraine. And if the Russians believe that any deal that we consummate will be violated in a few years because the United States is untrustworthy, that motivates them to take more rather than less territory. So if the Russians are hemming and hawing about exactly how much territory they should take from Ukraine, given how untrustworthy the United States is, it incentivizes them to take much more territory rather than to settle with less territory, taking less territory. So that's one place where you see this. Furthermore, you get the Iranian nuclear negotiations, which are about to start this Saturday, where, high-level American policymakers will be talking to high-level Iranian policymakers. If you're the Iranians, can you trust the United States? Remember, the United States entered into the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran, in 2015 under the Obama administration. Trump gets elected in 2016, comes into office in January 2017, and then in the summer of 2018, he tears up the JCPOA. The United States pulls out of the JCPOA, and the Iranians are left holding the bag. If you're the Iranians, can you trust any agreement with the United States? I don't think so. And my argument would be, of course, the Iranians are not going to place, under any circumstances, too much trust in any other country. That's not the way international politics works. But trust can matter on the margins, and it can matter sometimes in reasonably big ways. And I think that with regard to Iran, there's going to be zero trust on their part towards us, and that's going to complicate making a deal.
And let's look at a different aspect of the trust. What about from the economic potential going forward? And I'm specifically thinking of BRICS. Is this loss of trust, does it have the potential to make other countries around the world say, I just can't trust the United States. I don't want to put my economic future in their hand. Like, say, well, looking at what may be happening with Vietnam right now, I'd rather put my money in the bag of the BRICS countries, which seem to be more stable. Is that a risk?
Absolutely. This is a giant boost for BRICS. There's already talk that the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Koreans are talking. I'm not saying that there's any major agreement in the offing, but the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Koreans are talking about future economic relations in the wake of these disastrous tariffs. That just tells you that this policy that Trump has instituted gives countries all around the world incentives to work together to ameliorate the damage that will be done to their economies. Jeff Sachs, my good friend, recently said that what Trump has done may be one of the greatest boosts for international cooperation in modern history, because he's in effect going to force countries all over the planet to cooperate with each other to head off trouble at the pass. Whether they can do that is an open question, but these countries are going to go to great lengths to protect the national interest, to do everything they can to ameliorate the damage from these tariffs. Some of that will involve groveling to Trump. And Trump, of course, wants that. He wants countries to come and grovel, and some will grovel. Others won't, like the Chinese. But even those that grovel will understand they're not going to get everything they want, and they're playing with somebody who, even if he gives them a few bones, will still probably whack them in the head somewhere down the road.
Right. And you mentioned somebody who won't grovel is China. This comment at the open here of Caroline Leavitt from last night, where Trump had warned China not to go up to a 34% tariff rate, or he said there would be consequences, which then he went up to 104%. In response to Trump going up to 104%, China has now gone to 84% from 34%.
Yeah.
The finance ministry has just made an announcement that remember, there were 34% tariffs on all US goods coming into China. That's now been increased to 84%. An 84% hit on all US goods coming into China. Obviously, that's a clear blow to every US company wanting to sell into this huge market. It, no doubt, is going to send more shockwaves through, I would imagine, the markets, especially in the US. But like I say, especially hurting any American company wanting to sell into this market. There may well be other measures. The other thing that was mentioned in that statement is that Beijing is taking the Trump administration to the WTO. We sort of knew that before, though, the World Trade Organization. But there may be more measures to come. That's just been flashed right now, as I say. So, it's on. There's no backing down from the Chinese government.
So you have both Chinese not backing down and you have the Trump administration not backing down. What does this mean? I'm going to ask you two parts of this. First of all, what does this mean for U.S. consumers, this battle between the U.S. and China specifically?
Well, for U.S. consumers, the price of everything is going to go way up. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I think even Trump recognizes that. Again, this is his rhetoric about the short/medium term versus the long term. His argument is that we're going to pay a price in the short term, and this is part of that price, but this will work out to our benefit in the long term.
And what about U.S. business? Because obviously lots of American business, both medium and small even, do lots of business back and forth with China. What will that have a near-term impact on the U.S. business?
Well, it's going to have a negative effect on businesses that operate in China for sure. There's just no question about that. His bet is that what's going to happen inside the United States is that as a result of these tariffs, we're going to build up this powerful manufacturing base that's going to be good for business, good for American workers, and good for the United States in general. But as you pointed out at the start of the show, Danny, it takes time to build up a manufacturing base. It takes an enormous amount of capital. And if you're building the manufacturing base over a long period of time, you basically have to be able to send a signal to businesses that they should make investments in these manufacturing capabilities because they'll pan out in the long term. But in a world where you can't trust the president of the United States, you can't trust your own president, you're not sure exactly what he's going to do from day to day, are you going to have the confidence that's necessary to start building that manufacturing base? I mean, it may be the case that Trump doesn't even last 4 years, but even if he lasts 4 years, somebody else is going to come in to replace him. And that may be, a liberal Democrat who has a very different view on the necessity of creating a powerful manufacturing base, in which case, if you've invested a lot of money, it will have been like throwing money down a rat hole. So the point is, in an environment where you don't have a lot of trust in your leader, it's very hard to sort of do what Trump wants to do, which is build up the manufacturing base and make the argument that the fact that businesses are suffering in China doesn't matter because they'll flourish here in the United States.
And, it's one thing if you're talking about, those communist Chinese, they're the enemy, they're the pacing threat. We always talk about the military threat posed by China, but it's not just those guys. It's also the European Union.
In the last 30 minutes, the European Union countries has approved the bloc's first countermeasures against President Trump's tariffs, joining China and Canada in pushing back. The European Union is set to impose extra duties, mostly of 25%, on a range of U.S. imports in response specifically to the U.S. metals tariffs. It's still assessing how to respond to the car and border levies and the broader levies that the countries face. Now, these new tariffs will take effect from the 15th of April.
Okay, so this just adds a new layer of complication, a new layer of risk of trust or absence of it, even to our own economies, because we're so closely connected with Europe and culturally, economically, many other ways, definitely security. If they're also the economies are turning upside down in the near term, this whole thing could have a cumulative effect where it could even make more unlikely that we have the time and the money and the space, as you called it, to actually have create this whole industrial capacity, build it up in the United States. I mean, this just seems like we're making enemies everywhere.
Yeah, let me tell you my take on this one, Danny, and let me tie what we're doing with Europe to what we're doing with China. If you go to Europe and you think about the Ukraine war, we basically dragged the Europeans into the war in Ukraine. Remember that Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy did not want to bring Ukraine into NATO because they understood that it would be catastrophic in the end. And nevertheless, we, the United States of America, were the driving force behind the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war has done huge damage to Europe's economies, okay? And now we're talking about basically abandoning Europe, abandoning the Europeans and letting them deal with Ukraine. Okay. And along come the tariffs. The tariffs are another hammer blow at the Europeans. This is going to cause them more trouble. Not only have their economies been damaged by the Ukraine war, not only is the United States threatening to abandon them, but now we're hammering them with tariffs. Well, we're at the same time hammering the Chinese, and the Chinese are going to be looking for other markets. They're going to look to have economic intercourse of all sorts with other countries on the planet. Where is a more logical place to go for the Chinese and for the Europeans than for them to go to each other, to have a marriage, and for the Europeans to turn the Chinese into major league trading partners? Now, this is not in the American national interest in the sense that Europe may trade high technologies to China, which we don't want them to do, because that will help China grow its cutting edge technologies. We're in a competition here with China. We're talking about tariffs today. We're in a competition with China over developing cutting edge technologies. This matters enormously. One of the things that Trump wants to do is hurt the Chinese economy so he slows down their ability with regard to cutting edge technologies. Well, if you look at what we're doing to Europe and what we're doing to China, and you realize that we live in an interconnected world, doing this to Europe is just going to push them into the arms of the Chinese in ways that are going to help the Chinese develop cutting edge technologies and help the Chinese economy to get around these terrible tariffs. So you see, when you start to think about the idea of putting tariffs on everybody, that it could have really significantly negative consequences.
Is there any way to unwind this? Let's say that Trump is now looking around. He's like, holy crap, I've got myself into a fix here and I can't get out. And he calls John Mearsheimer to say, hey, what could I do now? Almost forget about saving face, but what can I do to make sure that I don't have, any long-term damage, especially on causing, some of our allies and our enemies or adversaries to come together in ways that are probably not going to be good for us. And it's, you mentioned the BRICS issue already. What can he do right now to undo some of this damage? Because if he keeps going down this path, I think that he's just literally just rolled the dice and said, we'll just see what happens. But if he wanted to take some proactive actions, what could he do to mitigate the damage?
Well, he can take the tariffs off or greatly reduce the tariffs. He can say, I made a mistake, either explicitly or implicitly, and reverse course. The question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is he to do that?
I don't think we actually have to ask that question. I think we know that answer.
I think that's very well put. I would argue, Danny, that my sense is that it would take tremendous pressure from all quarters on him to get him to reverse course. He is not the sort of person, as we all know, who admits that he makes mistakes and then reverses course. He's just not that kind of guy. And the stakes here are just, enormously important to him. It would be a tremendous humiliation. But one could argue that things will go so badly here. I'm not saying that will happen. And in a way, I hope it doesn't happen. But things could go so badly here that he has no choice but to reverse course. But, it's very important to understand that we're in an unprecedented situation here in the United States, in the sense that Trump has no checks on his power. We've never had a president who was so unconstrained. I think the closest you come to is Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. But you want to remember that the way he made these tariffs happen is that he declared that we were in a state of emergency. And this was an extreme situation that gave him the capacity to act as the ultimate decider. He didn't have to go through Congress to levy these tariffs. He could just do it himself. So what's happening in the world today is a situation where one person, one man decided to pursue a specific policy, and no other institution inside the United States of America, inside this liberal democracy, was consulted or was able to check him in any meaningful way. We've never had a situation like this in the United States. It just tells you that there are no guardrails here. President Trump is an amazingly powerful executive. He is like a king. He is like a dictator. He can do whatever he wants. And how you get him to reverse course is a really tricky issue, given the
Yeah.
power that he has.
I,
And
I, I think
I think what you need is you'll need an uprising from below. Maybe not just an uprising from below, but an uprising among the elite as well as from below, that leaves him simply no choice but to reverse course.
Yeah, then and I don't put that out of the realm of possibility, actually, for especially if he's right on the near term pain, and if it's much worse than he's thinking, it would what a little pain. If it gets worse than that, then I think that becomes a very real possibility. But there are two other areas I want to look at in the remainder of the time we have here. I'm going to talk about what could happen with Iran in a minute, because that could really complicate things here. But first, I want to real quickly, one of our viewers here has asked a question here I think is also relevant. I hope we can get some updates as to Russia is stepping up its attacks as we speak, and want to see what we thought. I think that's important, because and the way I want to craft this question related to the Russia and this big issue we're talking about today is Trump came into office and said he's going to have this war over within a day. Or he's even going to have it resolved before he gets into office, he said. And then a day. Well, then now 100 days. And now we're getting close to even that here. And we don't appear to be any closer to getting this thing over, even to get a partial ceasefire actually implemented than we were before. And so I think we're running the risk, as we've been talking about here on the show a bit, there are growing evidences that Russia is preparing some kind of larger scale operation offensive than they've been doing, maybe in the Sumy and in the Kharkiv area. I'm sorry, the Zaporizhia area in the south, maybe even in the Kupiansk area. Lots of moving parts there indicate that something bigger could be coming. If Russia, because they don't trust us, calculates that, all right, we're not going to get what we want with diplomacy that we can trust, so we're just going to get it militarily. And they just say, all right, we're going to continue on and increase our capacity. And then it turns out that they end up just taking by force what they want. That's going to leave Trump in a position to where he's come in and talked about this deal maker, and then now he appears to be impotent on making anything happen here. And the Russians are just going to roll down, which could be a tremendous psychological blow to the entire West, NATO and Europe, in that we were impotent to defeat Russia the first time, or to stop them from gaining what they want on the battlefield the second time. What would that have? How would that play into this larger area of lack of trust that you talked about?
Well, I think there's no question that if what you described happens, and what you're saying is that the Ukrainians will lose the war in an obvious way, it will be impossible for the diehards to even make the case that Ukraine is holding the line. And it will be impossible for them to deny that the Russians are either on the verge of victory or have won. I think in that case, Trump will be blamed. It will be analogous, Danny, to what happened to Biden in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Remember, it was Trump who decided to get out of Afghanistan. It's just that he kicked the can down the road so that it landed in Biden's lap, and Biden actually pulled out, and Biden was crucified for what happened in Afghanistan. And I think what will happen here is Trump will be crucified for what's happening in Russia, in the scenario, or in Ukraine, in the scenario that you described.
Yeah.
And I think that will be a huge problem for Trump, because he will certainly be taking flack over the tariffs. I mean, there's no question about that. The only interesting question is how much flack he'll be taking. It'll be a lot, but how much is a lot? That's the question there. But if you marry that to him taking flack over Ukraine in the scenario that you described, oh man. But I still think that the really interesting question is what happens if Trump gets into a war with Iran? I mean, one can tell a story where the economic, put aside the tariffs, just put it completely aside. One can tell a story where if we get into a major war with Iran, this has huge negative consequences on the world economy because the Iranians end up shutting down the flow of oil out of places like the Persian Gulf. The Iranians may target oil fields and oil terminals in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Coast states. And that would have terrible consequences, to put it mildly, for the international economy. So it would seem to me, given the tariff policy that he's now put forward, right, the incentives are not to start a war with Iran.
Man, you think that was the case. And by the way, I mean, you're talking about the elements of a potential, a perfect storm all moving around here. And if anybody thinks that that's theoretical, this was just yesterday in the Oval Office with Benjamin Netanyahu.
We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. And we hope that's going to happen.
And listen, John, if anybody thinks, okay, he's just talking and is kind of around the edges. Well, one of the reporters in the room point blank asked him, if diplomacy fails, then what?
On Iran, can you give us more details about where the meeting on Saturday is going to take place?
I can just tell you there's a major meeting going on between us and Iran, and that'll take place on Saturday, and it's at top level.
A lot of people think that those talks are not going to lead anywhere because the Iranians will never give up.
Sure. I think that's a possibility too.
If diplomacy fails, is the United States under your leadership ready to take military action to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and remove this threat?
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
So is that a yes?
You know, it's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is.
So
can't have it. Right now we have countries that have nuclear power that shouldn't have it. But I'm sure we'll be able to negotiate out of that too as part of this later on down the line. But Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if the talks are successful, I actually think it'll be a very bad day for Iran if that's the case. Yeah.
What worries me about many things worry me about it, but what is he saying? It's just not complicated. They just can't have a nuclear weapon, except they don't have a nuclear weapon. And according to even the Mossad, to the CIA, they have not started a nuclear weapons program. They've continued to escalate their capacity should they make that decision. That's true, but they don't have a nuclear weapon. So the terms that's been reported is what Trump's basically his ultimatum letter on the 19th of March said you have to dismantle your entire facility, your entire nuclear capability, your nuclear power capability and research, et cetera, the ability to reprocess and all that kind of stuff. And they have to curtail their missile capacity here, which would basically be saying you have to completely remove all of the chance that you have to defend yourself and then trust us with your security. Seems pretty unlikely to me. Ergo, if that's the objective and they don't meet the objective, then apparently there's going to be war. How do you see this thing folding out?
I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, what's at issue here, in my opinion, is the enrichment and reprocessing capability. The reason that the Israelis and the Trump administration didn't like the JCPOA is because it allows Iran to enrich uranium. And the Israelis and the Americans want that capability completely taken away. The problem is the Iranians did not agree to that back when the JCPOA was being negotiated, and they're not going to agree to it now. And the question is, where does that leave Trump? And your point is, he really, given his rhetoric, doesn't have any choice but to turn to bombing. And then we get into the whole issue of where that leads, especially in terms of the fact that we have this problem with regard to Ukraine now, and we have these tariffs and so forth and so on. It does kind of look like the perfect storm. I kind of find it hard to believe that he would actually start a war with Ukraine, given what's going on, start a war with Iran, given what's going on with these tariffs. But if he does, the consequences could be even worse than we're seeing with the tariffs. So this may be a perfect storm. Danny, I'd like to just make a quick set of comments to you about Trump and just about the whole Iran issue and what you said about Trump saying he could shut down the Ukraine war even before he came into office or one day in office. I think what Trump doesn't understand is that the world is incredibly complicated, and dealing with problems like Ukraine and the Iran nuclear program and dealing with China are not easy issues to deal with. At the same time, Trump thinks he's a genius, and he does not respect expertise. If you look at the people that he appoints to important positions, including his press spokesperson, these are people who shouldn't be in these positions. They're just not seasoned enough. They're not knowledgeable enough. And in some cases, they're not smart enough. But he doesn't respect expertise. If you just look at the appointments that he's made, and a really good example of this is that he has this guy, Steve Witkoff, who is his principal point person on dealing with Russia, on dealing with the Middle East, to include Netanyahu, and to include the Iranians. He's got three portfolios: Iran, Israel, and Russia. This is a man who has no diplomatic experience. He's not seasoned diplomatically. He's not studied these issues over the years. He's just a good friend of Trump. And he's obviously a very smart and competent man in the real estate world. Would you take a real estate mogul and put him out there to deal with three very complicated problems? If you were president, I don't think so. You'd want really smart people around who really knew the issues so that you could figure out the best possible way, maybe the least bad alternative for dealing with these complicated issues. But this isn't the way Trump operates. Trump thinks these are simple problems to solve. He basically knows how to solve them. And all he has to do is, get one or two people into positions of power who will work with him, and they'll fix these problems. And then he can point all these second-rate and third-rate people to other positions, and it really doesn't matter. I think this is a prescription for disaster. And I think if you look at what's going on with the Trump administration, this attitude of his explains a lot of where we're headed.
Yeah, it certainly does. And if we had time, I could go into some other areas where I see that exact dynamic playing out to just wrecking people's lives. But I want to stick with this in here one more time, because there's one more element in the decision-making process for Trump here, which I don't think should be overlooked. And that was the guy sitting right next to him, Benjamin Netanyahu, is putting lots of pressure on him. I think it was a month and a half or so ago, there was a big headline which we've used several times, where Netanyahu said he wants to finish the job in Iran using Trump's plan. So he said back then. And I'm going to show you something here. This is actually from 6 months ago from former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. But I think that what he said here is very widely agreed to on the Israeli government.
We have the legitimacy more than ever. We have the ability more than ever. Iran is at its most advanced point in history. It's acquired uranium in an amount for 10 nuclear bombs. This is crazy. They're building the bomb already, the bomb itself. So we're in the 11th hour. I would say strike the nuclear facilities, strike the regime. Don't be afraid. The Israeli nation stands behind you.
This is despite caution from the Americans.
That's correct.
So he had also said, and I don't remember if it was in that interview or a different one, that this is a 50-year opportunity, the best chance we've had to go after Iran to get the head of the octopus, as he calls it. And it sure seems that that's the idea of a lot of people, especially the guy who's currently the prime minister. How do you see the pressure from Israel on Trump?
Danny, as I've long argued, Israel is a strategic liability for the United States. It's an albatross around our neck. The reason we're fighting the war in Yemen now is because of Israel. The Houthis have come to the defense of the Palestinians who are a victim of a genocide in Gaza. And we are fighting the Houthis on behalf of Israel. The New York Times reported yesterday that military leaders in the United States have concluded that our war against the Houthis and our deployments in the Middle East are sapping our ability to contain China and East Asia. This is just all evidence of what a liability at the strategic level Israel is. And now we have this situation where they want us to attack Iran. And by the way, in April of last year, this is April 2024, and in October 2024, the Israelis tried to bait the Biden administration into a war with Iran. Why didn't the Biden administration enter a war with Iran? Because it's not in our strategic interest. Here we are again with the Israelis playing games with us, trying to get us into a war that is not in our interest. But this is nothing new. Fortunately, the Biden administration played this one smartly, and we avoided a war. Trump, I believe, deep down wants to avoid a war. And as we were talking about 5 minutes ago, the incentives for him now to avoid a war are greater than ever. So I think there is a reasonably good chance that we will avoid a war. But it won't be because the Israelis are helping us to avoid that war.
Right.
It will be in spite of the fact that the Israelis are pushing us really hard to get into a war that is not in the American national interest. And of course, all of their minions here in the United States will be working overtime to help push us into this losing proposition.
Yeah. Well, I really hope that we're able to push that back. I hope that at some point self-interest kicks in with the Trump administration. We're able to rein that back. I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump here real quick because I've got another television show to do real quick. And I've been reminded that I'm supposed to have already logged in. So as always, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic show today. Really appreciate everything you had to share with us. Thank you.
It's my pleasure as always, Danny.